Hi, I'm Amy Geiger. I'm the North America Cyber Strategy Lead at Accenture. I just joined Accenture and I come to this role with 20 years of experience in industry, mostly focused on IT risk management and cybersecurity, mostly focused on the banking industry, financial services industry. Prior to coming to Accenture, I was the Chief Security Officer at Huntington Bank, responsible for cybersecurity, fraud, physical security, and technology risk. At Accenture, as the North America Cyber Strategy Lead, I'm leading our North America practice focused on how we develop cyber strategies with our clients to protect business value and align cyber risk strategies with business priorities. I think the most interesting thing to me about this is how this has evolved over the years. When I first started talking about my roles, people's eyes would kind of get wide, and I think they didn't know what to ask because it was this abstract concept that was kind of behind the scenes, right? And what a lot of the conversations really revolved around was, either me talking about, protecting things, protecting organizational value, protecting data from, quote unquote, bad guys, right? Or drawing a lot of analogies to the concrete physical world that they could understand. So, I tend to use things like, we all drive cars, but, the brakes and the seatbelts are really important as safety mechanisms. And a lot of the work that I do is around how we make sure that we have those safety mechanisms in place in corporate America. The interesting thing that's happened over the last few years, though, is I think just as the ubiquity of data breaches has hit the news, right? I think cybersecurity has been elevated in the collective conscious of just the general public, right? My normal news feed has a lot of cybersecurity stories now, and so the reaction when I share my role is very, very different. They often want to understand, what my take is on the latest breach, or help me understand what some of the best practices are for personal cyber hygiene, things like not reusing passwords, phishing scams, or they'll tell me about the text they just received that seemed really strange to them, And so we end up talking a lot about the common social engineering threat vectors that just many end users are exposed to and the ways in which they can protect themselves. I tend to focus on relating cybersecurity to what those business and community leaders are focused on in accomplishing their outcomes and their objectives. What are they valuing? What are they going after? And then taking those risks, the risks that would be presented from a cybersecurity standpoint, and then frame in those business terms, framing them in relation to those business outcomes. I think having a mutual understanding of what's important and the outcomes that we're trying to drive collectively really helps build partnership, right? And it also helps business and community leaders understand that cybersecurity is a set of risks that is pervasive, and it impacts all of the outcomes that we're trying to drive in business, and just how important it is to integrate the mitigation of those risks in your strategies. I've often said that in my previous roles, right, security strategy doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it doesn't. I always thought about, how do we not have a security strategy? How do we have a secure business strategy? And how do we continue to drive that integration that really enables the security organization to be an enabling partner of delivering those outcomes with the business collectively? Finite resources, I think, first of all, we should just say up front that finite resources are something that affects all of us. Every business, no matter how big or how small, we're all confronted with that, whether that's time, people, money. That is a reality of doing business. So when I have to focus on, how do we accomplish the most we possibly can with the resources that we do have, I really focus on the intersection of business objectives, regulatory compliance, and risk. And so, first, kind of prior in my prior question, right? What are the business objectives? Where are we headed? What are we trying to accomplish? What are the implications from regulatory compliance? Right, those are non-negotiable table stakes that we need to address. And then what's the risk to those business outcomes? And what's the highest risk? Right. So in other words, what I would say, take a risk-based approach. And I think one of the things I always ask myself is, with this next dollar, right, with this next hour, with this next person, what's the highest and best use of that resource from a mitigation value standpoint? And it's all about prioritization. I think one of the things that we need to learn how to do in this industry is really prioritize, and be willing to revisit that prioritization as things change, as risks evolve, as new compliance regulations come out, as business outcomes change. And it's a collective and ongoing conversation that you're going to have with the business partners around the table on what do we need to do next. When I think of collective defense, I think that all employees, regardless of their role or function, play a really key role in the defense of the company, right? And those employees are often the first line of defense against threat actors, especially when you think about social engineering threat vectors, so phishing and other common social engineering attacks, which are often cases the starting point for many, kind of broader and far-reaching cyber attacks. So making sure that your employees understand that, number one, they have that role, that is a key responsibility, and that them staying vigilant, doing things like reporting suspicious emails, texts, phone calls, can help those of us who our job is everyday cyber, right? Identify and respond to, potentially leading indicators of an attack through those social engineering means. I think the other group of employees that is probably worth talking about in this context is technology employees, right? So I think all the things that I just said about your general non-cyber employee applies to technology employees, but I also think there's a need to make sure that as they're building secure systems, and that they are a part of that security. We talked earlier about finite resources, and I think one of the things when you look at the size of most typical IT departments and then most security organizations, it's not a one for one, right? And so part of the power of making sure that technology employees understand their obligations when it comes to building secure systems is you get a scaling factor in your organization, and extra eyes and ears and architects, if you will, of security through those technology resources. I think it's really important that they understand the risks impacting their technology and incorporate that in, so things that I'm thinking of, right? Secure coding practices, understanding what the common threat vectors are, how they code in a manner that is not going to expose that code or that application to vulnerabilities, things like understanding concepts of least privilege as you're architecting access, just architects in general. What are common security principles, and how do we always work to be designing security into everything that we're doing in technology? Upskilling is extremely important, and especially in light of a threat environment that is constantly evolving. And so I think just as defenders, we seek to innovate, apply new technologies and processes. The threat actors are trying to do that as well, right? We spend a lot of time thinking and talking about, automation, ML and AI and data analytics and all the things. Those are conversations that those threat actors are having as well to apply to their techniques. And so I think making sure that our employees understand, especially those technology employees, understand both the direction of the threat environment, where it's headed, and what are the critical skills needed today to be able to continue to defend is really important, so that we evolve with the threat environment. I think, when you think about the same applies to general employees, right? As the social engineering threat environment evolves, that's why we need to keep our employees informed. That's why we do phishing tests and those kinds of things. How do we make sure that this is top of mind for those employees, again, because they are a first line of defense. I think the same applies. So the threat environment's evolving, but our technology is evolving as well. And so I go back to the point I made earlier around making sure that technology employees are thinking about and educated in security in the products that they're working on, so that they're building security in. That applies to the evolution of technology. I see this in cloud. It's a great example there where the security objectives, what we're trying to do in cloud to manage risk, it doesn't really change from an on-prem perspective, right? We still want to have access management, right? We still want to have secure networking, all of those kinds of things. But how you implement that security is very different in cloud, and making sure that how is well understood, and it's a learning journey that everyone is involved in, is really, really important to make sure that you're building secure technologies. I always say that security is a team sport. I've heard that a lot in a lot of different arenas when we talk about cybersecurity. I think one of the most beautiful things about security is, when you think across companies, right, or even across industries, we're not in competition with one another. There's a lot of places in business where you can't engage in a cross company, cross industry way because of the competition aspect, right? We're all against the threat actors, right? And so I think we need to continue to think bigger and broader about who our team is, and push the bounds of what that definition is, and think, both within the organization. So a lot of the things that I was talking about, how do we think of our partners as extensions of our team in security to get that scaling factor within the organization, but I think outside the organization as well. How are we sharing threat intelligence? Can we do that better? How are we building deep, trusted relationships with our partners? How are we fostering public-private partnerships? Developing deep industry, relationships, with industry groups, ISACs, and those kinds of things. I came from financial services. FS ISAC was a tremendous resource to us in banking. And I know there's other ISACs out there for other industries. Getting to know federal and local law enforcement and specifically the cyber contacts around that. There's evolution going on the public side, just like there's evolution going on in the private side. And I think, the last 12 months or so, the level of engagement that we've seen, especially here in the US between public and private partnerships has been a step in the right direction. And I think that needs to continue to evolve. And we need to continue to foster this idea that we're kind of all in this together. I think having a network of trusted advisors and partners that you can rely on, that you can solve problems together with. How do we make sure we're not reinventing the wheel? Collectively learning what are the best methods to deal with some of the challenges we have, the finite resources, the rapidly evolving threat environment, the evolving technology, and how do we make sure that that we're working together to solve these problems. The risks of cybersecurity in our threat environment is never going to be solved by one company or one industry. And it's going to take us coming together significantly, I think, to continue to stay ahead of the threat environment. I think some of the key takeaways I would say is network, and again, I talked a little bit about building that trusted network of advisors and partners, and how really lean into that, being willing to something that I think I learned really early on in this career. I think is frankly one of the reasons why I love it is this is a continuous learning career. You learn everything every day, right? Like just the threat environment is evolving so very quickly that there's just new things to consume and learn every day. And I think having that network of advisors starts to help to spread some of that learning about, so how do you get lessons learned from other folks? How do you share and understand best practices? There's common problems, both within and across industries that we can collectively work on together. Context is everything. And I think one of the most important things that we can do as cyber leaders is deeply understand our business, understand where they're headed, what outcomes they're driving, and what is valuable to them. That will help to shape our prioritization. It will help to shape, our ultimately what we choose to focus on from a defense standpoint, right? And then making sure that with that context, we're integrating cyber strategies into business strategies. So, I would often talk to my teams when I was in industry around, we exist to enable the business. How do we securely enable the business? How do we protect business value? And that's another way, I also think, to address some of the finite resources, right? If the top priorities of the business is where the investment is going to be, then understanding how the things that we are doing in security align and ultimately protect that. Typically, what I've seen over the course of my career, that's how you get investment and engagement with what we're trying to drive.